In this world, you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world.
Has anybody ever asked you guys the question, like, what would you do if you knew you had one day left on planet Earth? Has that question ever been asked of you? You should start small groups off this way tonight, because it's interesting, right? You get to know people, you get to understand more of, like, maybe what they care about or what they're passionate about. And they're like, I would go and I would spend it with family, or I would go skydiving, or I would go, right, ride a bull named Fu Manchu, right? Like, what? I don't know what you would do if you knew that you had, that was a Tim McGraw reference for those of you. Any country fans out there? TJ Hadidian? Okay, this guy, stagecoach, hey-o. Hey, but, right, if you had one day left to live, what would you do? And the cool thing about the author John is he zooms in on this one night in Jesus' life. And a lot of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they paint these like broad brushstrokes of who Jesus is. Right? Matthew writes to a Jewish audience primarily. Mark is like this bang, bang gospel. Everything is immediately this, then immediately that. Luke's a doctor. Anybody's parents a doctor, or grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, right? The details that go into the medical world, those inform Luke as he writes his gospel, right? Everything is this detailed account of Jesus' life. And then John is just entirely different. Right? John skips the birth of Jesus. He skips Christmas. He jumps all over the place. He's not concerned with the timeline. In fact, John chapter 20, at the end of his gospel, he says, I write these things so that you might believe, and that through believing, you would have life in my name. John is infinitely concerned, not with your head knowledge of who Jesus is, but in a transformative belief in this Jesus. Like, my guess is the reason you're here in some way, shape, or form at church, like maybe somebody invited you, maybe for some of you, your parents forced you to be here on a Wednesday night. Maybe you want to come because like your friends are here, there's like a social element to it. But whatever your take on Jesus is, my guess is in some way, shape, or form, that Jesus character for parts of your life has seemed ineffectual, disinteresting, or complacent in your life. Maybe you've come to church and maybe you believe in Jesus, and yet there's areas in your life where you're like, it feels ineffectual. It doesn't feel like life and life abundant. It doesn't feel fully satisfying and fulfilling and like this peace that I can feel no matter what and that I can experience in him. Right? Maybe Jesus feels complacent in your life. You ever prayed before and it felt like your prayers were just bouncing off the ceiling? It doesn't feel like anything's actually happening in your prayer life. And in this series, so much of what I want to do is I want to look at this one night in Jesus' life and understand more of who he is, because I would love nothing more than for us as a community to fall deeper in love with this character that a lot of us have maybe never met before. You might have an idea of who Jesus is, and yet my goal and my passion in this series is that we would let the Bible, primarily the upper room, these couple chapters, inform us of who Jesus is. And I can assure you this is a different Jesus than most of us have been pitched before. He's better, more powerful, more interesting, more fun, more sacred. See, if I were to ask you this question, think about it for a second, and then I want to raise your hand if you have an answer for it, because I want to hear without y'all shouting at me. What do you think the number one, or what would you say the number one critique of Christians is? People go, oh, I don't like the church because Christians are fill in the blank, right? Pause. If you would go, Christians are, what word do you think gets used to describe Christians, followers of Jesus, more than anything else? Intolerant, okay. Hypocrites. Anybody ever heard a Christian called a hypocrite before? Okay. Intolerant for sure. I've heard that one a lot too. It's interesting that Christians get called hypocrites, right? This term hypocrite, it's an old Greek theater term, actually. Like a hypocrite was somebody that would wear a mask and pretend to be someone else. right? So you would have somebody playing a character on stage, and it was used in Greek theater to go like, oh, that person is hypocriting, right? They're being a hypocrite. And so now what people mean when they say that is, oh, Christians, they just act a certain way when they're at church, and they're like two-faced. They're a certain way there, and they're a certain way here. And so much of what I'm trying to do in this series is to get us to understand that, like, what if church wasn't about religion or trying to show up a certain way or doing the right things at right times? What if it was all about a person? What if it was all based on a historical event, this Jesus character coming to earth and then dying a death that you and I deserve to die, resurrecting from the dead, and like all of Christianity was based on that historical event? See, the irony of Christians getting called hypocrites is, if somebody were to say that to me, like, oh, you're just a hypocrite, a part of what I would say is like, yeah, for sure. Like, I think the primary difference of people in the church is going like, I am absolutely screwed up. Like, there's so many parts of my life, 168 hours in a week, where like I don't do the right thing. I get in arguments with my wife over petty, stupid things, right? I'm prideful. I want things when I want them, right? Like, I don't want to go and check on my crying daughter in the middle of the night. Like, I just want to sleep, and like the selfishness comes out inside of me, right? I look down on somebody else and think I'm better than them all the time. Like, the amount of brokenness that exists in my life, and you go like, well, you're a pastor. I'm like, yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things about the church is like, it's filled with people that should be the most aware of their brokenness and their need of a savior, right? Like, think about this. You don't go to the gym and tell out of shape, overweight people that they don't belong there, right? It's like, you don't, I'm a member at a gym. I don't show up at the gym and like walk up to the first like out of shape person I see and be like, what are you doing here? They'd be like, what do you mean, what am I doing here? Like, I'm trying to get better, right? Like, you don't go into a hospital and talk to sick people that have gotten better at a hospital and say, like, you can't promote this place. Does that make sense, right? Like, all church is it's like, I'm a beggar telling other beggars where they can find bread. It's like one of my favorite quotes of all time is by a guy named Tim Keller, and he says this: the church is not a museum for holy people, it's a hospital for the sick. The second we show up at church and we think that we have to have it all together here, it's like we're missing entirely the point of Jesus. And so much of my heart in this series is, as we look at John chapter 13 and John chapter 14 and John chapter 15, I want our primary question not to be, what do I do with this text, but who is Jesus? What do we get to see and know and understand about Jesus? Because I'm confident the more that we understand and know about Jesus, the more we'll understand what our role is within the church. Hey, this is not a museum for holy people. And the second it starts being that is when people going like, well, those are just hypocrites, and going like, yeah, for sure. If you think you can show up at church and be holier than thou and better than everybody around you, you're missing it. Church should be packed full of people that go like, I'm messed up. You too? Me too. We're all broken. And we get to go like, we need a savior. It's like, good news. There is a savior. Good news. The greatest exchange of all time. When we sought after creation over the creator, we exchanged eternal relationship with him for fleeting things. And then Jesus demonstrates his love for us in this with another exchange where he says, I'll take your sin and brokenness for my life. And so the night before the cross, the night before this happens, I want to dive into this story and understand more of who this Jesus guy is. The heart of God unveiled to us in the greatest act of love of all time. All right, so John chapter 13, verse 1. Hopefully you're there by now. If not, peek over with somebody next to you, read along. For the next couple of weeks, I would encourage you, like, bring a Bible with you. I'm not like anti-technology, but we all know, right, when a notification hits, your mind instantly goes to that notification. So be old school, bring a Bible. If you don't have a Bible, come find me. I would love to put a Bible in your hands, okay? John chapter 13, verse 1 says this. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to his Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress. The devil had already began to prompt Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father put all things under his power. He knew that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist. Hey, if you have a pen with you and you're like in the business of underlining your Bible, which I would encourage you to do so, right? To like circle words, underline certain words, to process through, okay, what is happening here? The amount of spaces in my Bible where something's just like circled, there's a line, and it's just like a massive question mark, and I'm like, WTF, right? Like, what is this? Like, I want to process through my Bible, and like, I don't want to just read something and go like, check, right? Christianity. It's like, y'all, wrestle with the scriptures. If this book is alive and active, if there's a God of the universe, and he revealed himself to us through his word, we need to wrestle with it, right? And like, I don't think enough of us dive into this book, myself included, enough, really asking the question of like, God, would you reveal yourself to me? Would you demonstrate yourself to me? For the last 3 weeks, we've studied, is there a God? Can we trust the Bible? Why do bad things happen to good people? My hope is on the other side of that, there starts to be a little bit of a hunger to dive into this book, to ask the question, who is this God? And I love this phrase, right, that we just read in verse 3. It says, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power. Okay, pause real quick and look up at me. So what does Jesus know? Jesus knows that his Father has given him all things. Right? That all things are given to him by his Father, that he has demonstrated that. So he says, Jesus knows that all things are under his power, 1. He knows that he's come from God, 2. And he knows that he's returning to God, 3. So Jesus, from this place of understanding who God is and what he's given him, where he comes from and where he's going, there's like this solid ground that he's standing on, this firm foundation, this sense of identity. And then it says, so he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped the towel around his waist. So notice that what Jesus is about to do is serve, and we're going to dive into that in a second, but he doesn't serve anyone until his identity is firmly rooted and grounded in where he came from, where he's going, and who his God is. So important. You ever done something like service-oriented, whether it was like pizzas this last weekend or serving in children's or like gone on a mission trip before? You ever done something like service-based and like done the deed and then like noticed that somebody saw you do it and we're like, it's not like a big deal or anything? You ever done that? Right? I was at a mentor of mine's house, like this older dude that I looked up to a ton. I was working at a camp called Hume in the Meadow Ranch in the junior high camp. And I was over at my buddy Derek Gear's house, and he went to the back of the room to like check on his kids. And I was like killing time. And so I got up and I started unloading his dishwasher. And then, this is embarrassing, I waited with like the last cup that was in the top rack of the dishwasher until I heard him like stepping back to the front of the house. And like as he was walking back in, I was like put the last dish in the cupboard, and he was like, oh, dude, you didn't have to do that. And I was like, oh, what, the dishwasher? Like, I mean, it's not like a big deal. Like, you got it, man. Like, I just appreciate you having me over here, you know? It's like, and it's funny to think about now, but I'm like, dang, I do that all the time. I love to be noticed when I'm doing things for other people, right? I love to be noticed when I'm like serving. And when somebody gives me that like nod of approval, it's like, I know, I'm a nice guy, right? And it's like before Jesus serves anyone, he pauses and goes, okay, who is my God? Where do I come from? Where am I going? It's like identity first, so that no part of his service was done from a place of trying to get the attention. And then it says this, after that he poured water into a basin, began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? And Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Jesus replied, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him. Hey, underline that word, betray him. And that's why he said, not every one of you is clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes, returned to his place, and asks them a question. Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for this is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them. Hey, pause and look up at me. Now, I don't think that what Jesus is saying here is that he washed the disciples' feet, therefore we should go around and wash other people's feet. Now, I don't think we should be above that, and I've been a part of groups that where you do that and it's like this really powerful moment. What I do think Jesus is saying is he is the God of the universe and is probably the last person in that room that should be washing his disciples' feet. Hey, this is like the final exam for the disciples. They've been following Jesus around for 3 years. They go to this upper room, which is why the series is called Upper Room. Right? They literally walk up these stairs. There's a room set up with dinner in it, and they're going to partake in the Passover dinner, which is this culinary nostalgic meal looking back to this Old Testament delivery of the nation of Israel out of Egypt. And they're going to partake in this meal together. And it was ritual going into a dinner like that when they walked into the room, there would typically be a basin of water and some sort of towel or a rag to wash your feet. Why? Because they're walking around in the streets in first century Jerusalem where there isn't plumbing. The primary transportation is mules and horses. The streets are made of dirt. And at best, they have some sort of rudimentary sandals on their feet. So if you think about their feet walking into that room, and tables there's no chairs and tables. You sit on the floor, you recline, and you eat dinner. So I don't know about you, I think in 2024 feet are disgusting. Rewind 2,000 years, and this was a gnarly scene. And so Jesus watches all 12 disciples walk right past the basin. They don't wash their own feet, they don't wash one another's feet. And I can imagine Jesus sitting there going, y'all missed it. You've been with me for 3 years. You've heard me teach about why I came. Jesus said, I came not to be served, but to serve. He says, I didn't show up for the healthy, I showed up for the sick. Now you talk about hypocrites. Jesus is demonstrating to his disciples, first and foremost, I'm here on planet Earth to seek and save the lost. I've come for those that demonstrate a neediness for God and understand that they are broken, and his disciples are still concerned about me. They want the best seat at dinner. They want the first foods. They want to be next to Jesus. They're not interested in serving one another. And so Jesus, I can imagine, with a little bit of a, okay, stands up from the table, wraps a towel around his waist, and the God of the universe in human form, the very last person that should be washing feet, takes it upon himself to serve. See, friends, you will never be further from the heart of Jesus than when you are expecting to be served. And you will never be closer to the heart of Jesus than when you are serving. How many of us show up to Omega week in and week out expecting to be served? What's snack this week? No, I don't like that. I don't want to do that. Why aren't we playing a game this week? Why are we playing a game this week? I don't like this song. Oh, I really like this song. Is my friend here? Is my friend not here? Right? Why are we sitting here for so long? What time is it? I got to pee. Right? How many of us show up to this space with a consumeristic mentality, expecting to be served? And I wonder if we're missing the heart of Jesus that says, do you understand what I have done for you? I, my Lord and teacher, have demonstrated to you what service looks like. Now go and do the same. And here's the kicker. Verse 18. He says, I'm not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen, but this is to fulfill this passage of Scripture. He who shared my bread has turned against me. I'm telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am who I am. Very truly, I tell you, whoever accepts anyone that I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me. After he had said this, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, very truly, I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. His disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which one of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to his disciple and said, "Ask him which one he means." Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It's the one whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. Y'all, if you don't think the Bible is funny, it's because you haven't read it, okay? This scene, I literally cannot wait. I hope heaven has some sort of like DVR that I can like rewind because I want to witness this scene. Okay, so how many disciples does Jesus have? 12, okay? 12 disciples. One of them is a guy named Judas. Maybe you've heard of him before. Maybe you haven't, right? But Judas, basically, what we're about to find out in this story is that Judas is going to betray Jesus. So he's going to sell Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver, and the religious leaders in the crowds, they're going to come and arrest Jesus. And a big part of this is because Judas sells out Jesus for this silver. Now, grand scheme of things, big picture, Jesus willingly goes to the cross. This isn't like Judas betrays Jesus and Jesus is like, "Oh, how could you?" Right? Even in this scene, we're seeing Jesus knows that this is about to happen. But I love this. Jesus is troubled in his spirit, and he goes like, "Hey, I'm not talking to all of you. Right? One of you is going to betray me." And Peter, the quintessential like talk and then think. Y'all know those type of people, right? You have a friend like that talks and then thinks. If you're like, "No, I don't know anyone like that," it's probably you, okay? Like, we all know those types of people. This is Peter. And Peter, in this scene, like what we just read, Jesus is like, "One of y'all is going to betray me." Now, if you're sitting at dinner with 12 people, and one of them goes, "One of you is going to betray me," what happens next? Everybody's at dinner like, I mean, not me, right? So Peter, right? Read this text again. Peter goes, "Psst, John." Right? It says that Peter motions to the one whom Jesus loved, which is John, right? John, the author of John, refers to himself as the one whom Jesus loved. LOL, okay? And he goes, "John, ask him who it is." Right? John's leaning up against Jesus, and Peter's like, "Psst, ask him who he means." And Jesus is like, "The one whom I dip this morsel to is going to betray me." And he like dips a piece of bread and then gives it to Judas. And then Judas is like, like, I don't know how this went down. I don't know if they like missed it. I don't know if this was like a private conversation just between Peter, James, and John. But somehow they miss this whole picture entirely. They miss that Jesus hands the bread to Judas, and then Judas gets up and leave. And then the next couple of verses are like, it says that Judas took care of the money, so they're like, "Oh, maybe he had to go buy some dinner for the poor or something." And you're like, ay. The amount of things the disciples miss about Jesus. And yet the grace that I have for him is like the amount of things that you and I miss about Jesus all the time. So we can look at them and be like, idiots. I wonder if that's us all the time, right? We miss it. We don't understand it. But here's the crazy thing about this story is when Jesus got up, wrapped a towel around his waist, and washed the disciples' feet, as he goes around to each person and washes their feet, can you imagine, like, does anybody really feel awkward moments? Does anybody just like feel it in the depth of their soul? Like when something's awkward, you're like, it just hurts, right? Like when Jesus is washing someone's feet is not a quick process. Like it's not like slap, water, right? Like it's slow and it's methodical and it's like painful. As Jesus does this to 12 people, who's included in that 12? Judas. Jesus washes Judas's feet, knowing full well what's about to happen. You ever known that somebody hated you and justified every action you had towards that person because you're like, well, they hate me? That ever happened to you before? You ever been really mean to somebody before and thought to yourself, well, they had it coming? Someone ever been really mean to you, maybe even at Omega, somebody was rude to you and you're rude right back? You go like, well, they had it coming. Friends, you will never be further from the heart of Jesus than when you are expecting to be served and have the mindset of, well, this is fair or they had it coming. The true mark of a follower of Jesus is our ability to respond to our enemies with love, especially under hardship, especially in that moment. When was the last time you had an enemy in your life, whatever that means to you, right? There's none of us in this room have real life enemies. Go to China where people are dying because they're professing their faith in Jesus. If we had Omega in China tonight, I wonder how many of us would go, I'll risk my life to go there. I don't know. Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't, right? But how many of you in this room would go like, man, the true mark of a follower of Jesus is our ability to respond to our enemies spontaneously in love? How do I know this, right? Skip down to verse 31 with me. Judas leaves. Awkward moment. It says, when he was gone, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is glorified and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself and will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me. And just as I told the Jews, I tell you now, where I'm going, you cannot come. A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. You must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Jesus says, do you want to know what the true mark of a follower of Jesus is? It's not how much you know about God. It's not your consistency at church. Right? It's not how nice you are to other people. It's not if you come from a Christian family or don't come from a Christian family. He says, the true mark of a disciple of Jesus is if you have love for one another. See, the Bible says that we are called to love our neighbor as ourself, which is a big claim, right? It's like, love your neighbor as yourself. That's hard to do. But the claim gets higher when it comes to the church. Right? It says we are to love our neighbor as ourselves, but we are to love our fellow Christian as Christ loved us, which frankly is far more than we love ourselves. Does that make sense? Right? If the call of the Bible is to love your neighbor as yourself, you can kind of go, okay, I know how I love myself, and so I can love my neighbor with that same degree of love. But if the call of your fellow Christian is to love the person to your left and the person to your right and the person all the way across the room and that person at Omega that you really don't like, it's like the call is to love that person as Christ loved you, which is much more than you love yourself. So how do we do that? Right? And I'm just going to give you 3 simple things as we close. Number 1, the only way to love in a way that Jesus loved us is to consistently and constantly push back to Jesus. It's like consistently turning the light on in a room. Every day, you and I need to wake up and daily push back into Jesus. It is impossible to spontaneously love your enemy without first and foremost going back to the source of love. Right? If you try and love from a place of just you, how loving are you? Maybe loving, but how loving are you at the end of a long day? Maybe not that loving. How loving are you at the end of 2 long days? Well, I didn't get that much sleep last night. Well, I was up till 4 binge watching whatever show. Well, I was, y'all, you and I run out pretty quickly. Okay? If we don't consistently push back into Jesus, I think we'll be incapable of this type of love. So when we're asking the question, how do we spontaneously love our enemy, let alone how do we just love those in Omega? Right? Like, I promise you there's nobody in this room that's like looking at you like, I'm going to kill her. Nobody, right? There might be some of you that don't quite get along. There might be some of you that are like, that's not my favorite person. But there's nobody in this room that's like, yeah, after tonight, that's it. Right? Like, it's not going to happen. And yet, I've been here like 4 or 5 months, and I would say, I don't think we do a bad job of loving one another, but I also don't think we do the best job of loving one another. Like, I think there's a bunch of you in this room that's like, I don't even know who that girl is, or I don't even like that guy, right? It's like, how do we, stay with me, how do we as the church respond to when Jesus says, they'll be known as my followers by the love we have for one another? If I just asked Omega, give yourself a grade, F all the way to A+ on how you do loving one another, just Omega, like just this crew, how do we do? I don't know. Right? Maybe we talk about it in small groups tonight. Stay with me. Wasn't an actual question. So how do we do that? How do we love one another? Number one, we have to consistently press back into Jesus. Number two, we have to serve, right? When I say the phrase, you'll never be further from Jesus than when you're expecting to be served, and you'll never be closer to Jesus than when you're serving, my follow-up question, and this would be a question that I actually have for you in small groups, is where in your life are you serving? Where in your life are you consistently putting yourself last, putting others before you? Right? And we're giving you plenty of opportunities within this context, but even in other contexts, where are you serving other people around you? And number three, lastly, I would say seek reconciliation consistently. Hey, reconciliation, big word, but it just means to mend relationships. Where there are broken relationships in your life, where are you consistently moving towards reconciling them? Moving towards mending that relationship. Not for the sake of mending it, but it's because what Jesus asked us to do. Hey, I'm going to bring the band back up here, and as we sing this last song, here's my challenge for you, okay? As we're singing this last song, my challenge is to take a little bit of time and just between you and God, just do a little business with God, okay? So don't distract the person to your left. Don't distract the person to your right. Just between you and God. Right? Would you have a moment where you go, all right, Jesus, right where I am right now, maybe you just analyze, how am I doing loving the people around me? Not because of me, but if the true mark of a follower of Jesus is how we love one another, how are you doing with that? And that can't just be us trying harder to love. It's got to start with coming back to the source, going like, how am I doing with love himself? We can't hope to love horizontally if we don't have this understanding of this love relationship that exists vertically. And what I love about this song is this entire song is all about going, man, who am I to deserve this type of love? Right where you found me, God, you love me, but you love me way too much to leave me there. It says you love me as you find me. And in this song, pay attention to the lyrics because there's so much power in the gospel lyrics of this song that just say, God, you are love yourself. And you're calling me into this loving relationship, but that it shouldn't stop there. We gotta consistently come back to this vertical love and then let that pour out to the people around us. You'll be known as my disciples by the love that you have for one another. Let's stand to our feet. Let's worship.